Hello there, you're watching the press preview. A first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. It's time to see what's making the headlines with the journalists and broadcasters, Theo Usherwood and Sonia Sodha, who'll be with us from now until just before midnight. Let's take a quick look and see what is on some of those front pages. Well, the Austrian school shooting, which has so far cost 11 lives, features on the front of the Metro, which calls it a revenge massacre by a former pupil who had reportedly complained of being bullied at the school. The Financial Times, as you might expect, leads with tomorrow's public spending review and says Chancellor Rachel Reeves will make affordable homes a high priority. The i2 points to housing being a key issue in the review. The NHS is expected to be one of the big beneficiaries tomorrow, but the Times says economic modelling has shown that extra cash on offer will not help the health service reach its targets on cutting waiting lists. Defence is also expected to benefit in the spending review, but according to The Sun, the RAF's Red Arrows are running out of aircraft. The Mail says a rise in the jobless figures has damaged the Chancellor's plans to boost the economy with what it calls a massive spending spree. And after the U-turn on winter fuel, the Express demands another about-face, this time on increased taxes on family farms. Meanwhile, The Telegraph says Deputy Prime Minister Angela Rayner is scrapping the 200-year-old law that makes rough sleeping a criminal offence. The UK's decision to sanction 2 right-wing Israeli ministers over their policy towards refugees in Gaza is the lead story in The Guardian. And the Daily Star says Pentagon officials have been accused of planting bogus information about aliens to cover up secret weapon tests at the Area 51 military base in Nevada. Right. We're joined in the studio by Theo Usherwood and Sonia Sodha. Great to see you both. Lots about the spending review, unsurprisingly, in the papers. But let's start with the Metro and that horrific story coming out of Austria, this shooting. I mean, there's still lots of question marks about the actual motive. But it does seem, at least reported here, that bullying may have something to do with it. Sonia.
Yeah, that's right. And, you know, in the hours after a total tragedy like this, there's always incomplete information flying around. This was a shooting at a high school in the Austrian city of Graz. Yeah. We know that 6 girls died in that shooting in that high school, 3 boys, and at least 1 woman who's believed to be a teacher. There are some really horrifying details that are emerging from parents who received calls from their sons and daughters while they were in the school, and they've only, they found out hours later that their child was still alive, but you can just imagine what those parents were going through. And, just really kind of awful details emerging. But the gunman was a 21-year-old former pupil who apparently suffered bullying at school, dropped out, didn't graduate. Sometimes that features as part of these stories, but I think it wouldn't be responsible to speculate about what might be behind this yet, because we've obviously not got a complete picture, and that's sort of for the Austrian police.
The shocking thing is that it's always shocking, but we're more used to seeing these stories coming out of the United States. Not so much in Europe, but they do happen.
Yes, as Sonia said, it's too early to speculate as to the precise motives, but as you mentioned, of course, Barbara, that this seems to be following a pattern that we've seen, or a trend we've seen in America over many years now, of school shootings where pupils who are either at the school or have just left the school have been felt bullied or targeted, have gone back to exact some kind of warped revenge, and it seems to have been the case, although, of course, I'm sure the police will continue to try to determine the exact cause of what's happened in this particular tragedy. I didn't realise this. Austria has, I was listening to a bit of commentary as I drove over to Sky News, Austria has quite a hunting culture, and the gun laws in Austria are much more relaxed, apparently, than in other parts of Europe, which inevitably has led to this 21-year-old former pupil getting hold of a large amounts of ammunition and weaponry in order to commit this atrocity. And of course, we've seen, in the wake of Dunblane, we saw tightening up of gun laws significantly here in the UK, and that's had a much more positive effect, obviously. then you move on to knife crime. But particularly in these sorts of cases, guns can do just so much more. Not necessarily always the case, and we've seen the horrendousness of targeted knife attacks, particularly in Southport. But guns can, they do seem to have much laxer laws in Austria, and perhaps now that they'll tighten up those laws to ensure to try and mitigate against another tragedy like this happening again.
Yeah, absolutely horrific story. Let's move on to the Daily Telegraph, and really let's move on to the spending review, which will finally be announced tomorrow. We start with the Telegraph. There, Rayner drops low on rough sleepers, but also, if you look at other front pages, housing is one of the main issues, isn't it?
Yeah, so I think Angela Rayner is going to be pretty happy about this set of front pages. So she was one of 3 departments, along with the Home Office is one of the others, who were holding out in terms of their negotiations with the Chancellor in terms of what their spending budgets were going to look like over the next few years. The Chancellor will be setting it all out tomorrow in the spending review. And I think she will be pleased that she has managed to secure 39 billion, I think it's over 10 years, to invest in building more affordable and social housing. That's basically housing that's built with public investment that is available for below market rent for people on lower incomes. When you look at the small print, however, this is very positive. There's no question that we need more social and affordable housing in this country, and that we haven't been building enough. And actually, if you look at our history of building housing, the only time when the UK has built enough houses to meet population need has been when the government has invested a lot more in housing itself alongside the private sector. The private sector never builds enough houses. But when you look at the small print, 39 billion sounds like a massive figure. It's actually an increase from just over 2 billion a year to 4 billion a year. Now, that is not insignificant. That's a lot. But, the question mark over all these big figures, and we've got other papers asking this of the NHS, these increases are good. It's an increase in capital spending. It might help catalyse more growth because it's, money going into the construction industry and the house building industry. But is it enough? That is a real question, I think.
Yeah.
So obviously, the Chancellor changed the borrowing rules last year to enable this level of borrowing for infrastructure projects, capital projects. I think, to agree with Sonia, I think it's a big win, obviously, for Angela Rayner going into tomorrow's spending review. But of course, this money is, ultimately, it's going to have to be paid back, and the Tories are making the point that this is inevitably going to lead, Mel Stride, the Shadow Chancellor, making the point that inevitably this is going to lead to increased taxes in the autumn budget. And I think also what's interesting is this row that's developing, and the FT pick up on this particularly, between London missing out. Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, he was there for the vast majority of his tenure as the Mayor of London. He's had to face off against a Conservative government. Now he finds himself supposedly working with a Labour government, and you'd have expected him to do quite well, or London to have done much better. And he's making the point that actually it's looking like London's going to miss out while this money is, targeted in parts of the north of England, where Labour feels under threat from Nigel Farage's Reform Party.
Let's take a look at some of the other front pages. The Eye, Rayner forces new housing pledge from Labour, but then also the Daily Mail. And Sonia, talk us through this. Reads rocked by jobs slump.
Yeah, so this is a bit of not so great. But there's been some more positive economic news for the Chancellor, which is, perhaps higher than expected growth figures over the last quarter. But this is really not good news for the economy. So latest employment data shows that unemployment is the highest that it's been for 4 years. And I think it's around 250,000 jobs have been lost in the economy since the autumn budget last year. Now, that is worrying, I think. I think ministers will be very worried about it. Because Labour is banking on a growing, buoyant economy by the time the next election, so people feel better off. It was Labour's #1 pledge when they got elected. vote for us and we will restore growth. You'll have the fastest growing economy in the G7. And this is, this is a sort of little alarm bell sounding that perhaps things aren't so good. And it comes at a time when Labour has U-turned on the winter fuel payment. And instead of going to voters and saying, we've U-turned on this because, we made the wrong decision and we really listened, they said, it was the right decision last year because, the fiscal situation was so bad. But now things are picking up and that's why we've changed this. And
they've had a lot of pushback on that.
Yeah, and this is one sign that, the British economy has got very long-term structural issues. Labour were never going to come in and be able to click their fingers and fix them overnight. But this is a sign that things are not, things are structurally unsound in some bits.
And also, Theo, I guess one U-turn isn't enough because the Daily Express front page kind of want the government to make another one, this time over the family farm tax.
It's not going to happen.
No, but that's what they want. Tell us why.
I think sometimes newspaper, you can't. But it is always the danger that, of course, if you give way on one particular policy, then everybody expects you to give way on other policies. Now, in this case, it's the family farm tax, as the Express calls it, from which basically removes half the exemption that farmers have from inheritance tax. And the Express feel that actually having all but U-turned on every part of the winter fuel allowance, now it's time for this to come into play. I can't see it happening. I think it's going to be interesting to see particularly what happens, what detail we get on the two-child benefit cap and whether the government's actually going to remove that completely now. Of course, the total cost of doing so would be around £3.5 billion. But listening to ministers speaking on the record, it seems that that's definitely that's very much a possibility. But just to Sonia's point, and I listened with to Beth's slight incredulity when questioning Keir Starmer about the U-turn. Well, the economy is so much better off. We're going to hear a lot tomorrow from Rachel Reeves, I think, about people feeling the difference. That actually that Labour needs to now ensure that people feel the difference. But if you look at the numbers to the front page of the Mail, the economy is still not doing well. And I think that actually Labour would have been much better, the government would have been much better to acknowledge that. And when it comes to the winter fuel allowance, say, we made a mistake, hold our hands up. I think that would probably go down much better with voters, especially as they're trying to win over trust.
We're obviously going to find out the details tomorrow, but from what you know, what you can see, the balance between defence, obviously, that we've heard about, NHS, housing, everything else that's been announced, do you think it's the right balance?
I think Labour are treading very cautiously, and you can understand why, because the fiscal situation is not good. I think the political risk for Labour is, though, they get to the next election, there isn't growth that's fallen like manna from heaven. The economy is still struggling along. Living standards haven't really gone up very much more. People don't feel better off. And public services, yes, more money has gone into services like health, but the issue is that the NHS was in such a state when Labour inherited it, partly because of austerity, partly because of the pandemic, that actually they've stopped it getting worse, but it doesn't feel great. And that is a political risk. So if I were them, I think I would probably be being a bit bolder. I would be making the case. Lots has changed since we got elected. We've got Trump in the White House. That has implications for the economy. It has implications for defence spending. The world is a tough place, and we're probably going to need to ask you to pay a bit more tax. I think I would be starting to sort of lay the trail for that a bit more, just because I think it's the honest thing to do.
Briefly, Theo?
You could do that. You could take that approach. I think the danger, of course, is that economic growth ultimately comes from the private sector, and the private sector, businesses need to be encouraged to invest. They need to be encouraged to take on more people. And if you're putting up tax like they put up national insurance contributions for employers, going back to the autumn budget, when it comes down to brass tacks, and whether it be small business or in the boardroom, CEOs are tapping their fingers on the table, thinking actually it's just not worth the risk.
OK, well, we'll find out all the details tomorrow for the spending review. For the moment, stay with us, because coming up, we'll be discussing this story on the front of The Guardian. With the headline, UK imposes sanctions on Israeli ministers for inciting violence. We'll explain when we come back.
We're rolling.
Welcome to the world.
Our new podcast, starting now. It's very exciting.
Every week, we'll be reporting from the world's trouble spots.
We get to hold those in positions of power accountable, and we get to ask the questions that the audience, the listeners, want to know about.
And that's why it is so important that people tune in, come along for the road, come along for the journey. It'll be fun.
I'm Dominic Waghorn, Sky's International Affairs Editor, covering a world that seems to be unravelling. War, unrest, revolutions.
It's not his country, it's ours.
They have succeeded for the first time in their country's history in removing a leader from power. No freedom! Sky News, the full story first. There was fighting here, but there's clearly now a lull, and they're using it to bring up more ammunition. This is a mass exodus in which Russia is hemorrhaging some of its brightest and its best. According to the local weather channel, there have been more than 2,500 lightning strikes and flash flooding, all on top of this week's lethal tornado. What stays with you most in this job is some of the people you meet. What is your worst fear about what the Russians want to do to the children?
They're just boosting demographics by stealing young people.
Would you like to take the opportunity, Mr. President, on Sky News to invite Barack Obama to come here? Mr. Trump, are you running for president? Can you confirm it?
We're going to take a look, a very serious look.
On that day, we saw your fighters killing women, killing children. Was that a mistake? Did you go too far? You couldn't control your fighters? The full force of the state is being used to crush any protest. Free wherever you get your news. It's half an hour now past the deadline that Hamas issued, and we've now seen a third barrage of rockets coming in.
Another alarm. The mood here is jittery and nervous.
We're seeing the world get more and more divided, and it's our job to try to make sense of it all.
Jubilation in the streets, while some emotional.
This is a political victory for Prime Minister Modi and his Hindu Nationalist Party.
I'm Neville Lazarus, and I'm Sky's reporter based in Delhi.
Companies like these are helping India in its trajectory to be a serious player in space exploration. Sky News, get the full story first.
We've got your Sunday mornings covered. From the front page and the sounds of the streets to the voices of the people who make the major calls and big picture politics beyond Westminster. We'll put you at the heart of our story. I'm ready. Are you? Join me, Trevor Phillips, Sunday mornings on Sky News.
Welcome back. You're watching the press preview. I'm joined in the studio by Theo Usherwood and Sonia Sodha. Let's go to a story that broke a little bit earlier today, and there's been quite a lot of reaction out of the US. But let's start with the actual story itself. Front page of The Guardian. UK imposes sanctions on Israeli ministers for inciting violence. Theo, let's start with you. It's ministers Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, the sanctions, asset freezes, travel bans, and, obviously quite... Sort of quite a statement, I suppose.
It is a statement from
the issues that are facing Israel.
Yes, it is a statement from the UK, and it's a statement alongside Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and Norway, and in placing sanctions against those two Israeli government ministers. This was a pre-prepared move, of which Israel was given little notice, according to the front page of The Guardian. And David Lammy said in that joint statement that we're steadfastly, this is the UK government, committed to the two-state solution and will continue to work with our partners towards its implementation. The statement from Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, is it's punchy. The United States condemns the sanctions imposed by the governments of the United Kingdom, Canada, Norway, New Zealand, Australia on two sitting members of the Israeli cabinet. The sanctions do not advance US-led efforts to achieve a ceasefire, bring all the hostages home and end the war. And I think Mr. Rubio has a point. You can see why David Lammy has done it and the government has done it from a domestic point of view in terms of domestic politics, but it's very difficult to see how these sanctions, which we've seen traditionally reserved for, Russian oligarchs close to Vladimir Putin, will actually have any material effect on Israel. And it's worth mentioning, I think, that Israel is a really important strategic ally for Britain in the Middle East. The Israeli government has repeatedly and as a long-standing relationship shared intelligence with Britain when it comes to terrorism and potential attacks against the UK and its interests. And I think it's very easy to see this just through a prism of it's just a move with no consequence. There will be consequences to doing this, which I don't think advance the national interest, the UK national interest.
Let's look at the front page of the FT with the pictures of Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich. They are national security and finance ministers, quite high up in the government and necessary for Netanyahu to maintain his coalition as well.
So they are members of Netanyahu's coalition. I think it's important to say that they're widely considered to be on the extreme end of Netanyahu himself is seen as pretty right-wing within Israel. These are two members of his governing coalition who are seen at the more extreme end of that cabinet. And the reason why the sanctions have been imposed is in large part because that they have, these states believe, incited violence against Palestinians in the West Bank through statements they have made. And it is interestingly something that David Cameron was looking at doing just before the election, but was then advised that it was, he shouldn't do this during an election campaign. So it's not just this government, the previous Conservative government has also looked at this. And, there's definitely the pragmatic question of the most important thing in terms of what's happening in Gaza at the moment is what pragmatically might get Netanyahu to lay off what's going on at the moment, I think. And I think international pressure on him from states like the UK, Canada, certainly not worked to date. But, we do have this really tricky situation where Netanyahu, I think, is waging the war in a way that is speaking to the extreme members of his coalition rather than actually
Very briefly to both of you, was it a mistake then for the UK to impose these sanctions? You've sort of
I don't think.
Answered.
Yeah, it's obviously kind of sort of symbolic. It sends a strong signal. I think when you look at what these coalition members have said, it's really disgraceful. So I wouldn't say so.
Well, I think if to Marco Rubio's point, if the point is that we need to bring about peace in the Middle East and we need to bring an end to this awful conflict, then surely it's for David Lammy to get in the room, not to move his chair further away from the door.
The Rubio comments broke less than an hour ago, so it'll be interesting to see what reaction we get from the government. Very, very quickly, Daily Telegraph, the Chagos Islands deal, that presumably the Telegraph is not a fan of, because they call it the surrender deal. Who wants to discuss it? Theo.
OK. I think what's interesting about this story, and you're quite right to point out, of course, the Telegraph is a right-leaning paper, it's not a fan of this deal. And it makes the point that given that we're handing the Mauritius £30 billion, up to £30 billion over the next 99 years or so, that this is basically going to allow the Mauritian government to wipe out its national debt and allow ministers to abolish income tax for 81% of employed Mauritians. I think what's interesting about this, and the reason that the Telegraph have put this on the front page, is that in itself the story is not a big deal. But it's
I'm so sorry, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you both so much.
A show of military might and menace. Why should the West trust you?
Frankly, I don't care whether the West trusts us or not.
Sky News. Get the full story first. Have a quick word for Sky News. Is the West right? Are you fueling Russia's war machine? American journalist Evan Gershkovich is on trial here, but was first on display. I'm Ivor Bennett, Sky's Moscow correspondent.
We arrive. A secret hospital hidden in the Myanmar jungle, treating the victims of this bloody war. This is Myanmar today. Its military rulers don't want the world to see, but we have.
I fight for my own future. I fight for my generation's future.
This is an actual crime.
They don't care for that.
Myanmar army is only a couple of kilometers away. So this is a major humanitarian disaster.
It's 11 o'clock. This is Sky News' extended press preview, our top story. A gunman kills 10 people at a school in Austria before taking his own life. A second night of disorder in Ballymena as riot police try to prevent what the force says is racially motivated violence. The Prime Minister makes more promises ahead of tomorrow's spending review, but can't escape questions about how he'll pay for it all. Health officials in Gaza accuse Israel of killing at least 39 people near aid distribution centers. And here, the government imposes sanctions on 2 Israeli ministers it says have incited extremist violence. Also tonight, President Trump warns of tougher military measures if protests against immigration raids in Los Angeles escalate. Over the next hour, we'll be discussing today's news with our reviewers, Theo Usherwood and Sonia Soda. And later, we'll have a full run-through of tomorrow's front pages. Good evening. 3 days of national mourning have been declared in Austria after a gunman shot dead 10 people at a school. At least 28 other people were injured in one of the worst mass shootings in the country's history. The gunman died after turning the weapon on himself. Austria's chancellor has called the massacre a national tragedy. Well, over the next hour, we'll bring you tonight's headlines, tomorrow's front pages, and the views of our paper reviewers, Theo Usherwood and Sonia Soda, who are both journalists and broadcasters. Well, let's go back to our top story. The attack took place in the southern city of Graz. Police were called to the school mid-morning with more than 300 officers and 160 paramedics scrambling to the scene. Sky's Rachel Venables is in Graz tonight and sent us this report.
The gunman arrived just after 10 in the morning, a former student, moving between his former classrooms, firing at pupils as he went.
My cousin, he was wounded here at the shoulder blade. He tried to run away and he was shot here from the back. Like this, it went through. It didn't stay there, it went through.
Hundreds of paramedics, police and special forces raced to the school. Helicopters scanned the area, while officers helped rush survivors to safety as parents fought to find their children, praying they were safe.
My son called me today to say that he's in school and being shot at and that he thinks he's going to die. I've now just found out 2 hours later that he's still alive. I want to go and see him. I've tried asking 3 people whether they'll lend me their bicycle to go and see him. They didn't let me. That breaks me.
Police in Graz, Austria's second largest city, say they brought the situation under control within minutes. The dead and injured include students and adults, girls and boys. Investigators say the attacker is thought to have taken his own life in a bathroom at the school.
The perpetrator was a 21-year-old person from the Graz area. As far as we know, only 2 guns were used, and we found them at the scene. They're being inspected, and the perpetrators seem to have been allowed to have these weapons. Further investigations need to be done.
With light falling, locals have begun turning up here to pay tribute at the entrance of this high school, leaving flowers and lighting candles. These streets are unnervingly quiet, a palpable sense in the air of grief and loss, real shock being felt by everybody. Austria has one of the highest gun ownership rates in Europe, but mass shootings until today have been exceedingly rare. It's the kind of attack we're used to seeing in America, not Austria, and it's the country's deadliest since the Second World War. Austria's leader spoke for the nation when he expressed his deep shock at what had happened.
Diese Tat trifft uns alle.
This event hits us all as people, as parents, as a society altogether. The school is more than just a place of learning. It is a space of trust, of being at home there, and a space for the future. That this safe space was hit by such a violent act makes us speechless.
Austria will now observe 3 days of mourning as the families here begin a lifetime of grief. Rachel Venables, Sky News in Graz.
Well, let's see how tomorrow's papers are reacting to that story. The Metro writes, revenge massacre at school by a former pupil who had reportedly complained of being bullied at the school. In the Express, former pupil shoots 10 dead in Austrian school attack. And the Times reports, bullied school shooter kills 10 in Austrian rampage. Let's get the thoughts of Theo and Sonia on this. Sonia, let me start with you. You know, there's a lot of speculation about the motive. What we do know is that he was a former pupil. We don't, you know, the police hasn't officially said anything beyond that. But it is shocking to see something, just a school shooting that we tend to see in the US, but actually to see that on European soil.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really shocking. There's at least 10 people who are dead, 6 female students, 3 male students and 1 female teacher, the last one is thought to be. And yeah, it's just a complete and utter tragedy. As you say, we don't know much yet about the motive. The Times is reporting that there was a suicide note found at this man's home. There are other reports that he might have been bullied at school, that he didn't graduate, but obviously it's just too early to kind of speculate about what the motive might have been. But I'm sure that there hasn't been much conversation today about Austria's gun laws, but when we've seen this sort of shooting in other European countries, for example, here in the UK, in Dunblane in the 1990s, that did lead to fundamental reform of our gun laws to tighten them up. And Austria does have relatively relaxed gun laws compared to some parts of Europe. As Theo was saying, you know, in the last half hour, there's culturally a lot of hunting. There's actually been a big increase, the Times reports, in gun ownership from 1 million to 1.5 million guns in under a decade. They're owned by about 375,000 Austrian citizens. So it's probably too early for that conversation to happen today. But when you see a tragic sort of incident like this happen on this scale with this number of young people killed while they were at school, I'm sure it's going to lead to a conversation about those laws.
And Graz is Austria's second city, but it's not that big a city. It's more like a big town than a city, looking at the numbers, a few hundred thousand people.
Yes, it's a relatively small city, and Austria has quite a large rural population. So outside of Graz, then, hobbies, as I was mentioning, and Sonia mentioned, like hunting and outdoor pursuits are very popular. I mean, it is extraordinary. 1.5 million registered firearms for 375,000 individuals. I mean, my maths isn't fantastic, but that works out at 3 or 4 guns per person. And as Rachel's report identified, it appears that these 2 guns that were found close to the assailant, he was perfectly entitled. They were illegally owned firearms. So yes, of course, I'm sure there'll be questions now about what next for Austria. That conversation may not start as soon as tomorrow. There are 3 days of national mourning, but it's a conversation that certainly, I'm sure, will be had in Austria.
Yeah, and sadly, we spoke to quite a lot of reporters from Austria. There's already a conversation about security in schools because there was none at this one. Sonia, Theo, stay with us. Let's bring you some breaking news now. And demonstrators are clashing with riot police for a second night in Ballymena in Northern Ireland. Now, the unrest began yesterday, late last night, over allegations that a girl had been sexually assaulted. Police say that the unrest that followed was racially motivated disorder and 15 officers were injured. Conor Gillis is in Ballymena for us tonight.
It is night 2 and it is just as ugly. The angry mob and the scenes that we witnessed last night on their rampage, well, this is continuing to spill across this town. Police coming under attack with bricks, petrol bombs. You've just witnessed the water cannon truck driving away. That has been deployed over the past couple of hours as well. Clearly, there is simmering tension in this part of Northern Ireland, and that is boiling over once again tonight. Police are saying that last night's ambush on the home of ethnic minority members of the community here was racist thuggery, pure and simple. And that, Barbara, I think seems to be an excuse that is being used by some here tonight to fuel some of the additional anger. Because let's remember, this all began with a peaceful protest yesterday after that alleged sexual assault on a teenage girl here in this town. 2 teenage boys who are Romanian have appeared in court, and tonight another man has been arrested. But that vigil, police say, has been hijacked, continues to be hijacked by anti-immigration protesters, and police say there has been a degree of planning. Well, I can tell you here tonight, this very much feels like another planned night of violence. We've heard stories today of families having to barricade themselves into the attics of their homes in the streets around these pictures that you are seeing here just now. Clearly, police are in for a long night, and the talk here in this town is it could go on for weeks yet.
Conor Gillis reporting there, and of course we'll be reporting on events in Ballymena throughout the night here on Sky News. But next, the Chancellor has announced a £14 billion investment in nuclear energy as part of the spending review, which she will present to Parliament tomorrow. Rachel Reeves will update MPs on the budgets being allocated to government departments until 2030. But she and the Prime Minister face pressure to explain where extra funding on the winter fuel allowance, defence and extra free school meals will actually come from. And the papers tonight are full of promises of billions more to be spent on affordable housing. Our political editor Beth Rigby reports now on the trade-offs facing the government.
Rewiring Britain. The PM in East Anglia today to give these students some good news.
OK, so far so good. So far so good, yes.
A massive money injection for a new nuclear power plant where they live in Suffolk.
This is about good, well-paid, secure jobs, skilled jobs across a range of topics as we go down this road in relation to Sizewell.
This is a big investment, £14.2 billion to develop Sizewell C, with more than 10,000 jobs to be created over the next decade. All part of a capital spending blitz, the government borrowing tens of billions to invest in power stations, rail and tram networks, scientific research up and down the country. The message: the government will invest to renew Britain. But in all of this, a health warning. When it comes to day-to-day spending on public services, a squeeze is coming as the government prioritises NHS and defence spending, with the Home Office and local government among departments losing out.
It really brings together.
Questions then around whether Labour will meet manifesto promises, be it on housing and policing. Questions too on whether the government will stick with other plans after buckling over winter fuel allowance cuts. Can you just be honest about winter fuel allowance, that you reversed it because of poor local election results, you realised it was really unpopular, and you listened to voters? That is the truth, isn't it?
Well, of course we listen to voters all of the time. That's part and parcel of being a politician. The first question is, did we make the right decision in the first place? I believe we did, because we needed to stabilise the economy. I wanted to look to see whether we could have more pensioners eligible for this winter. I announced that some weeks ago.
You realised you got it wrong?
No, we had to. I could have pretended in the budget that there wasn't a £22 billion black hole. I wasn't prepared to do that.
So you're reversing a tax-raising measure, and now all the talk is you're going to have to raise taxes.
Everybody understandably challenges me to say you're going to put tax up. We didn't do it in the spring statement, notwithstanding most people saying you're going to. Equally, I don't think the first lever that a government should go to is the tax lever.
This spending review is a massive moment for a Prime Minister who's had a tough first year and now wants to turn the corner, but in practice it's all rather difficult. The economic outlook is uncertain, and this Prime Minister is under acute pressure from his MPs and voters too not to cut spending. That's what the winter fuel allowance reversal shows. And so in the coming months, he's going to be under even more pressure to raise taxes again. This is not a moment to decide tax rises. That all happens in the budget in the autumn. But this spending review is a moment that will define Labour in power and how our country looks and feels for years to come. Beth Rigby, Sky News, Westminster.
And here's a sneak preview of what Rachel Reeves is expected to say tomorrow, according to a Treasury press release, which has just dropped. The Chancellor will say this government is renewing Britain, but I know too many people in too many parts of the country are yet to feel it. This government's task, my task, and the purpose of this spending review is to change that, to ensure that renewal is felt in people's everyday lives, their jobs, their communities. Well, here's how tomorrow's papers are covering what we know of the spending review. The FT, as you might expect, leads with tomorrow's public spending review and says Chancellor Rachel Reeves will make affordable homes a high priority. The Daily Mail says a rise in the jobless figures has damaged the Chancellor's plans to boost the economy with what it calls a massive spending spree. And in The Times, picking out the big winners and losers in the spending review. Well, let's go back to Theo and Sonia and see what they're making of all of it. Sonia, interesting there, the words of Rachel Reeves. It's all about people feeling the impact. You know, on something like defence, they're going to have to spend a lot of money, but you're not going to necessarily feel it in your everyday life. Other things, the NHS, you will.
Yeah, well, that is the hope from Labour. So the really key thing going into the next general election will be, are voters feeling better off themselves? I mean, they don't care what GDP figures say. They care about how much money they've got left at the end of the month. And, you know, do public services feel better? Have NHS waiting lists come down, for example? And that is a really big test that Labour has to meet. Now, there is no question that there is more money going into places like the NHS and defence than there were under Conservative spending plans. The problem is that the state of the public realm that Labour inherited from the Conservatives, partly as a result of 15 years of austerity and public spending cuts, partly as a result of the pandemic, for example. Public services were in a real state. You know, NHS waiting lists were at a real-time high. And even though you've got sort of 60% of the cash increase of spending going to the NHS, health experts are looking at that figure and saying, well, that's only a 2.8% real terms increase year on year for the NHS. Historically, the NHS, since its inception to 2010, had 4%. And that's because as you get better medical technology, as you have an ageing population, you need to be investing more and more into your health service as a wealthy country every year. That's what other countries do in terms of standing still. So that is the big challenge for Labour. There is no question there is more money going into public services in the public realm than the Conservatives under their spending plan. But the fact is that most economic experts thought that the Conservatives' spending plans were completely pie in the sky, and the Conservatives, if elected, were not going to stick to them.
So it's a very different approach to what started with David Cameron and George Osborne, where they cut and cut and cut in order to bring the public finances under control. And of course, the argument from Labour is that that had a knock-on effect in terms of poorer public services. Therefore, you had an NHS that was unable to get people back fit, ready to work again. You had an army that was not ready to fight. And what Labour is basically trying to do with these major, especially these outlays around capital spending, is to almost go back to the Obama approach in the wake of the financial crisis, is to pump huge amounts of money into the public realm, and then that in itself generates more in tax revenues, because defence industry, for instance, and this is the way they're looking at defence spending, is actually, you know, if you can get big contractors taking up, you know, employing people in highly skilled jobs, then they're paying tax, and then that obviously has a knock-on impact with supported businesses they support as well. Whether it, you know, the gamble is, of course, it needs to work, and the line from the Chancellor that you just read out from the press release, it's in the FT, that people need to feel better off, is right. But of course, if they don't feel better off, then they're going to look towards other parties, namely Nigel Farage's Reform Party, and that is why tomorrow's spending review is so critical. This needs to be base camp for the next 4 years. That will lead, ultimately, Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves would hope, to either mitigate against severe losses or possibly even a Labour second victory.
Interesting how the day before the spending review, actually, a lot of the conversation was around the winter fuel allowance, the U-turn on that, and the reasons for, you know, obviously it was not a popular policy, but their argument, the government's argument that actually it's because the economy was stronger, was pushed back on. Do you think that casts a shadow on tomorrow?
I mean, I think it does, to the extent that this is partly about the substance, but it's all about the politics as well. And I think Labour they've held themselves hostage to fortune by getting elected on a pledge of saying, if you vote for us, we'll turn around the economy, it'll all be great. And that is quite risky because so much of what goes on in the economy is our long-term structural issues, which you can't fix overnight, and then also what's going on globally, you know, Trump's war on tariffs. And I think that actually the way they've handled the U-turn on winter fuel payments is one illustration of that, because by saying, well, last year we were in really difficult fiscal circumstances, so we had to cut winter fuel payment, and now things are much better, so we can restore it to many millions of pensioners. Again, they're kind of holding themselves hostage to fortune and not being that honest, because everyone knows that the reason why they are doing it is because it hurt them politically, and they probably should have U-turned on it much more quickly if that's what they were going to do. So I think voters are getting quite wise to this, and it feels like they're sort of being a bit inauthentic and maybe even a little bit untruthful.
Let me bring you some words that she's due to say tomorrow, according to this release. So she's going to say, I've made my choices in place of chaos. I choose stability in place of decline. I choose investment instead of retreat. I choose renewal. So stability and renewal, very much what she's trying to push.
Yes, and of course, in contrast to, she's trying to strike a contrast, the Chancellor, between Labour and the 14 years of Conservative rule. But just to go back to before the general election, Keir Starmer and indeed Rachel Reeves made a great play of the fact that they could be trusted with the economy, that this was going to be, you know, the whispers were the grown-ups are back in the room and they're going to be running the country, and Labour can be, you know, indeed trusted to make the big decisions, to get the big calls right, to get Britain back on its feet. And when you watch the Prime Minister give that answer to Beth about, you know, well, we had, you know, the economy is in so much of a better position that we can now reverse the winter fuel allowance cut. It slightly smacks of, well, we're just going to go back to the sort of the smoke and mirrors approach and the disingenuous, you know, it was dishonesty from the last government that this is a sort of return. Far better just to be much more upfront with voters about the state of the economy, about the decisions, about making mistakes and getting things wrong, and to keep that credibility with voters, because that is ultimately the platform, the pedestal that Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves want to stand on if they're fighting off Nigel Farage. They need to keep that credibility, because ultimately, if they don't, then Farage will fight them, and the Conservatives will fight them on broken promises and on not being honest with voters. And that's not a fight that I'd have thought that Keir Starmer and his team in Number 10 would want to get into.
And I guess also, you know, whatever is decided in the spending review takes us to the next election.
Yeah, that's right. And, you know, I think, as I was saying, it comes down to how people are feeling. And I think the political risk for Labour in all of this is that they are putting more money in. They are allowing themselves to borrow a bit more when it comes to levels of public investment to try and kickstart private investment to get that economic growth that they so desperately need. But they are quite constrained and they are playing it quite cautiously in some ways. And that's because they don't want to lose their reputation for fiscal credibility. But I think the political risk for them is they go into the next election, and unless there's a real economic upwind, things start looking rosier globally. People are a bit like, well, you know, we've had... the public have basically had stagnant living standards since the financial crisis now. Things haven't moved that much. And the danger for Labour is they go into the next election and things haven't moved that much more again.
OK, well, we'll find out all the details tomorrow, and we are on air with a special programme for the spending review tomorrow from 11 o'clock. This is the press preview on Sky News. Coming up, we'll be discussing how the papers have covered the UK's decision to impose sanctions on 2 Israeli ministers and how the US has already condemned the move. Stay with us.
jubilation in the streets, while some emotional.
This is a political victory for Prime Minister Modi and his Hindu Nationalist Party.
I'm Neville Lazarus and I'm Sky's reporter based in Delhi.
Companies like these are helping India in its trajectory to be a serious player in space exploration.
Sky News, get the full story first.
We've got your Sunday mornings covered. From the front page and the sounds of the streets to the voices of the people who make the major calls and big picture politics beyond Westminster. We'll put you at the heart of our story.
I'm ready. Are you?
Join me, Trevor Phillips, Sunday mornings on Sky News.
A show of military might and menace. Why should the West trust you?
Frankly, I don't care whether the West trusts us or not.
Sky News. Get the full story first. Have a quick word for Sky News. Is the West right? Are you fueling Russia's war machine? American journalist Evan Gershkovich is on trial here, but was first on display. I'm Ivor Bennett, Sky's Moscow correspondent.
Hello, you're watching the press preview where I'm joined by Theo Usherwood and Sonia Soda. We're going to hear from them in just a moment. But first, the Foreign Secretary David Lammy has confirmed sanctions are to be imposed on 2 Israeli government ministers. Those ministers are Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir on the left and the Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich on the right. Tonight, though, the U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has condemned those sanctions, saying, "We remind our partners not to forget who the real enemy is." Mr. Lammy made this statement.
Ben-Gvir and Smotrich have been inciting violence against Palestinian people for months and months and months. They have been encouraging egregious abuses of human rights. We have been raising this with the Israeli government, both privately and publicly. We were raising it before we came to government, and indeed the last government raised it as an issue. And alongside our partners, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Norway, today we are announcing sanctions against those individuals because we have been absolutely clear. This has to stop, and we stand for a 2-state solution. And the settler violence that we've seen in the West Bank particularly is entirely unacceptable and must stop.
David Lammy there. Well, let's take a look at how the papers are covering the story. Well, it's the lead on The Guardian, which states Australia, Canada, New Zealand and Norway have also joined the UK's decision to sanction the Israeli government ministers. And on the front of the Financial Times too, sanction blow to Israeli cabinet ministers. The Times covers this as well. It writes Israeli ministers sanctioned by UK over, quote, monstrous comments. Let's go to Theo and Sonia on this again. It was interesting because the sanctions were announced earlier today, Theo, and then we had this comment about an hour ago from Marco Rubio, very much against these sanctions. What have you made of it, and how do you think the government might respond to Marco Rubio?
But I think it's going to find itself in a tough spot quite quickly. The second paragraph from Marco Rubio's statement, we reject any notion of equivalence. Hamas is a terrorist organisation that committed unspeakable atrocities, continues to hold innocent civilians hostage and prevents the people of Gaza from living in peace. We remind our partners not to forget who the real enemy is. And I think that I would have thought that the job of the British, the Foreign Office and David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, is to get in the room and to try and support a negotiated peace and to bring what we are seeing in the Middle East to a peaceful resolution as quickly as possible. And I'm at a loss as to see how this decision to sanction 2 members of the Israeli government does that. I mean, the statement from Hamish Faulkner, the Middle East minister, sounds rather lectury, we must hold them to account and protect the viability of the two-state solution. I'm not sure it's the job of the British government to hold another government to account. I think it's the job of the British government, I'd have thought, given the history in the region, to get into the room and to actually have credibility with both the Israelis and the Qatari government and indeed the US government, and to try and bring about some sort of immediate ceasefire and a negotiated, long-lasting peace. And I don't see how this announcement today does that.
I mean, it's interesting because, you're talking about a ceasefire in Gaza, but actually David Lammy mentioned a two-state solution, the West Bank. And I suppose, you could argue they've been trying to get in the room and try to come to some sort of solution, and it hasn't worked. But still, do you feel that this might be counterproductive, Sonia?
Well, there are two things, right? There's pragmatically what might cause Netanyahu to step back from the brink in Gaza and what he's doing in Gaza. But there's also sort of taking a moral stand. And the truth is, I'm not sure how influential the UK is with Netanyahu. I think Trump probably is in terms of world leaders. Trump is incredibly unpredictable, but he probably has more influence over Israel because of the power that the US holds. Britain, I think the evidence is that Britain is not that influential.
And the other countries, Canada, Norway, New Zealand, Australia.
Yeah, and look, there has been a lot of international condemnation of Israel, and Israel is held to a higher standard because Israel is a liberal democracy. Hamas is a terrorist organisation. So,
proscribed as such in this country.
Absolutely. So there's been a lot of international condemnation of the disproportionality of Israel's actions, and it hasn't had a big effect. But when we look, I think it's important to be clear that these are two extreme members of Netanyahu's cabinet. They're widely seen as on as far-right members of his coalition. And one of the main reasons given for these sanctions on them as individuals is because they've incited violence against Palestinians by Israeli settlers in the West Bank, which is directly contrary to a two-state solution. I think it's important to say there is some political sort of consensus on this, in the sense that David Cameron was thinking about doing this, but then was advised not to because it was during the election campaign last year. And a former Conservative defence minister has come out and said that he completely understands why the government has done this tonight. So, it may not achieve very much, but sometimes I think you do need to take a stand.
I suppose that's the question. What is the diplomatic role of the United Kingdom in this conflict, Theo, do you think? Do we have one?
Well, I think part of the problem is that, like the UK, like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Norway have also signed this statement, is we're going for something in a two-state solution, where when you look at the situation, what happened on October the 7th, it is very difficult to, if you put yourselves in the shoes of Israel and of those who live in Israel, to see how you can give statehood to what would be a country that would be run by potentially Hamas, that went and murdered 1,200 of your citizens, took another 250 hostage, keeps those hostages, refuses to hand them those remaining alive.
That's not the proposition, though, is it? A Hamas-run state. That could not be a two-state solution.
But it's very difficult to see how they've tried Hamas and this is the invidious situation that Israel finds itself in. I agree with you. You could not have Hamas, but the fear is always that Hamas would come back, that it's a cancerous terrorist organisation that would find itself inveigled into the whatever transpires from that two-state solution, and it has remained committed throughout every day since that atrocity on October the 7th to committing another October the 7th. And so I understand, and in an ideal world, we'd have a two-state solution, but it's I do have some sympathy with, and nobody that I've ever spoken to in Israel or in British Jewish community has ever spoken of anything other than the horrors that happened on October the 7th and the long-lasting impact that it's had since that awful day 2.5 years ago. But there is a 18 months ago, but there is a problem, a fundamental problem, that how do you actually allow a country to exist that basically wants to exterminate you?
I mean, I think the problem is there's no
in my first term,
Forgive me, Sonia, we're going to have to go to live pictures of Donald Trump leaving North Carolina and speaking about the protests in Los Angeles.
For a long time. And I said, when are you going to call? When are you going to call? And I said, if I ever do this again, if they're not responsive at the beginning, not at the end. You know, I called in the military in Minneapolis, but it was 7 days. I waited for this guy, the same guy that ran for vice president, who's a very dumb person. He's a low IQ individual, like many Democrats are. But I waited for him to call him in. I kept waiting. I'd call him every day and say, when are you calling him? And finally I called him because I'm not going to wait. They were destroying the city. The whole city was burning down. Horrible. Okay.
A judge has set a hearing for Thursday from Governor Newsom's lawsuit. Do you think your administration will be successful Thursday for the hearing?
Well, even Senator Fetterman said very strongly that this is horrible what they're doing and that the Democrats are making a big mistake by not talking about it. And I agree with that. I think this is in a league with, and maybe even worse in a true sense, what they're doing is now worse than men playing in women's sports. I think that's a ridiculous thing. Open borders, you take a look at open borders. Open borders is what caused it. Many of these people, many of them, not all of them, I guess, but many of them came through the Joe Biden stupid open borders. Really sad to watch. It's very sad to watch this being our country. Now, with our National Guard and our, fairly low number of Marines, they had no chance. And if you look, they were a little bit tougher than the police. Did you notice that? The police are trained not to do it. They're really trained. They're under tremendous political constraint. They're great police. I know the police in L.A. I know the force. They're very good, but they're not allowed to do their thing. They're just not allowed. They're restricted by radical left politicians who are pretty shameful.
As Commander-in-Chief, sir, what rules of engagement do you want for the military? What limitations?
A very simple rule of engagement. If they're dangerous, if they're throwing concrete or bricks, if they're spitting in the face of the police or whoever's in front of them, if they're punching people, if they're doing all of the things that you see done for the last 3 nights, that I would say is engagement. We need to keep our city straight. I want to save Los Angeles. And Newsom is totally incompetent. He's not going to do it. Look at the fires he had. He had fires where half the city, it seemed, burned down. What was it, 25,000 houses, all because he wouldn't take water. I released the water from the Pacific Northwest, and it came down millions of gallons a day. And it's right there right now. They'd like to send it back. There's something wrong with these people. All I want in terms of engagement, I just want to see peace. If there's peace, we get out. If there's even a chance of no peace, we stay there until there's peace. And a lot of people are being arrested. The rioters, or whatever you want to call them, they better know. A lot of people are being arrested. They're going to be in jail for a long time. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. President.
President Trump, he's just landed at Joint Base Andrews. He's now getting in his car, presumably heading to the White House. He was in North Carolina a little bit earlier, speaking at Fort Bragg, one of the biggest military bases in the United States. And we just heard him there speaking about those protests in Los Angeles. He has, of course, deployed the National Guard and Marines. And he was also using not very complimentary language about the governor of California, Gavin Newsom. Of course, the two are having a political clash as well over the deployment of Marines and the National Guard. We have our teams in Los Angeles, and we'll bring you the latest on that as the story develops. You're watching the press preview. Coming up, we'll have a full run-through of tomorrow's front pages and discuss more of the day's news.
secret hospital hidden in the Myanmar jungle, treating the victims of this bloody war. This is Myanmar today. Its military rulers don't want the world to see, but we have.
I fight for my own future. I fight for my generation's future.
This is an actual crime.
They don't care for that.
Myanmar army is only a couple of kilometers away.
So this is a major humanitarian disaster.
You're watching the press preview with some of the stories making tomorrow's papers. With me in the studio, Theo and Sonia. Let's take a look at some of the stories not quite making the front pages, but still super interesting. Metro, no, forgive me, Times, page 4. Sonia, this to you. Data harvesting by menstrual apps risks women's safety.
Yeah, this
That's
really
scary.
caught my attention because there are a lot of commercial period tracking apps there where you basically, put into your phone when your period starts every month, etc. Women use them sometimes, basically to try and sort of use natural means not to get pregnant or when they're trying to get pregnant. Exactly. I've never used them, I have to say, because even on Apple phones, other phones are available, you can do the tracking through your health app, and it's never appealed to me, I have to say, because it feels like such personal data that they're getting on you.
Can I just say, though, it's so useful, though. So what's this story about?
Well, so this story is a University of Cambridge study, and it's warned that basically it creates this data goldmine. These commercial companies can sell your data on, and it might include information about your health, your reproductive choices, diet, medication, sexual preferences, hormone levels, and contraception use. This is all really valuable commercial data. If a company knows who's trying to get pregnant, for example, they can push you loads of stuff around babies, for example. So I've always thought this data, for me, different people have different boundaries. For me, it's always been too personal to share with commercial companies. One suggestion is that maybe the NHS could develop a non-commercial app that might be safer. But also, maybe you should just use old-fashioned ways of tracking your periods.
Like a calendar.
Exactly. That's what I do.
Exactly. To something completely different, Theo. You get driverless Uber taxis. They could be rolling out in London next year, really?
Yes, Uber is to launch self-driving taxis, according to page 4 of the Metro, and it's going to be the app services will first have a human in the driver's seat who can take control, but the aim is to go fully driverless, according to the newspaper. I'm not massively keen on a driverless taxi. I'm also slightly perplexed that given how congested central London is now when it comes to driving, and of course I'm sure these driverless cars Uber's going to be very conscious about accidents and so forth, whether they, with bumper to bumper, whether the computer is going to be willing to drive as aggressively as necessary to get anywhere in London at the busiest times.
Or maybe everyone will stick to the 20 miles an hour limit.
Well, I think if every car in London was driverless, I could see it working, but I'm not convinced.
What do you think?
Who knows? Technology is a fine thing. So apparently you already find these cars in some American cities, and if they're rolled out in London at first, it will be with a human in the front who can take control. But the thing that makes London tricky is that it's not like a US city where you've got a grid system and traffic lights at every junction.
They're not built for that. Okay.
It is more difficult to drive.
Sonia, we're going to have to leave it there. Sonia, Theo, thank you both so much. Thank you.